Schönen guten Tag, liebe Seherinnen und Hörer des YouTube-Kanals der Zeitschrift International. Hier spricht wieder Fritz Edlingen. Das ist eine kurze Einleitung zu einem bzw. zwei anschließenden Videos. Es handelt sich um ein Gespräch, das in englischer Sprache im Übrigen, aber dazu noch später, von unserem Freund und Kooperationspartner Pascal Lottaz von Neutrality Studies aufgenommen wurde, moderiert wurde. Es geht um das Thema Waffenabrüstung. Der Titel des Gespräches war Arms Control is Dead and so might we be. Es ist ein Gespräch im Wesentlichen mit zwei Experten, zu den Experten auch ganz kurz. Die zwei Experten waren und sind Professor Tom Sauer, Professor für internationale Politik an der Internationalen Universität Antwerpen in Belgien. Und sein Gesprächspartner ist Professor Heinz Gärtner, emeritierter Professor für Politikwissenschaft der Universität Wien und neben anderen Aktivitäten auch Redaktionsmitglied unserer Zeitschrift, der ja regelmäßig auch in unserer gedruckten Ausgabe publiziert. Sie sprechen eben über die gerade in den letzten Jahren deutlich größer gewordene nukleare Bedrohung. Die Gefahr ist, dass immer kleiner und anwendbarere Atomwaffen tatsächlich zum Einsatz kommen. Die Gefahr ist nicht nur technisch gegeben, sondern sie ist auch politisch gegeben, insofern, dass das internationale Abrüstungs- und Kontrollsystem in den letzten Jahren deutlich verringert wurde und abgebaut worden ist. Den Seherinnen und Seher wird sicher in Erinnerung sein, der spektakulärste Fall, dass die Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika während der Präsidentschaft von Präsident Trump einschlägige Kontrollmechanismen, Verträge darüber aufgekündigt haben. Das ist aber nur ein Beispiel für eine Reihe von anderen Beispielen, sodass die Welt tatsächlich mit einer deutlich vergrößerten Gefahr konfrontiert ist, dass es im Falle irgendwelcher Konflikte dann zu Kurzschlusshandlungen kommt und es tatsächlich zu einem Einsatz von Atomwaffen kommt. Das ist zu verhindern. Da geht es tatsächlich um Leben und Tod, und wir sind als Zeitschrift, als Projekt ein Teil einer internationalen Bewegung, die versucht, dem entgegenzuwirken, das zu verhindern, indem man zumindest über die Gefahren, soweit es möglich ist, informiert. Und dieses Gespräch ist ein Beitrag dazu. Ich darf nochmals darauf hinweisen, dass es in englischer Sprache geführt worden ist. An sich sollte automatisch bereits deutsche Untertitel eingeschaltet sein. Sollte das in Ihrer Version, liebe Seherin, lieber Seher, nicht funktionieren, dann bitte, Sie kennen inzwischen, hoffe ich, die nötigen Handgriffe, die gesetzt werden müssen, um eine deutsche Übersetzung automatisch einzuschalten. Und nochmals zur Technik. Es ist, wie gesagt, ursprünglich ein Gespräch von ein Viertelstunden gewesen. Wir haben uns entschieden, in Kooperation und in Übereinstimmung mit Pascal Lottaz das Gespräch in zwei Teile zu teilen. Das ist jetzt die Einleitung zum ersten Teil. Es wird dann einen Tag nach der Veröffentlichung dieses ersten Teils automatisch auf unserer Webseite der zweite Teil im Netz stehen. Es wird dann keinen weiteren Vortrag oder keine weitere Einleitung von mir geben. Ich bitte das auch jetzt schon zur Kenntnis zu nehmen. Das wird also Schlag für Schlag und gleich anschließend funktionieren. In diesem Sinn, schauen Sie sich das an, liken Sie das Video, es ist wirklich wichtig, leiten Sie es weiter, das ist ein Thema, das jeden und jede angeht. In diesem Sinn, herzlichen Dank für Ihr Interesse und bis zum nächsten Mal.
CTBT on testing has not been entered into force, has not entered into force. The ABM treaty does not exist anymore on missile defense. INF has been mentioned, is not anymore by Trump. Open Skies Treaty has been suspended by, and put thrown in the dustbin by Trump. New START, the latest one, bilaterally on strategic nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, has been extended by Biden and Trump, but it ends in 2026. And nobody expects that there will be a successor. And that will be the first time since the beginning of the 70s that there will be no bilateral strategic arms control treaty anymore. And so these two superpowers, nuclear superpowers, then have the freedom to build up without any bilateral control and verification.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to my two academic colleagues, Tom Sauer and Heinz Gärtner. Tom is professor in international politics at the University of Antwerpen in Belgium. He's a specialist in security studies, especially in nuclear arms control, proliferation, and disarmament. His latest co-edited book is titled Alliances in Asia and Europe: The Evolving Indo-Pacific Strategy, Context, and Interregional Alignments. Heinz, too, is a university professor and lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. He's also a board member of the International Institute for Peace. In 2022, he and I co-edited the volume Neutral Beyond the Cold: Neutral States and the Post-Cold War International System. Tom, Heinz, thanks for joining me today.
Morning, Pascal.
Good morning. So both of you are experts on nuclear affairs and security. And I would like, in this first part of the interview, to talk to you about especially where we stand worldwide in the nuclear question. And just for everybody listening, we have 9 nuclear weapon states today. 5 of them possess these weapons in accordance to international law and in accordance to the so-called Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapon, the NPT. Those are the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France. And then we have 4 nuclear weapon states who possess them because they got them afterwards, illegally, but they got them anyhow: India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, although Israel is the one that never actually said I have them, but it's an open secret that they do. Tom and Heinz, let's maybe start with Tom. Of these 9 states, which one are you most worried about who could potentially use a nuclear weapon, and where is the entire discussion about non-proliferation and decreasing the weapons today?
Yeah, let me start by saying that there's a complete crisis nowadays with respect to nuclear weapons governance, both in the arms control arena, non-proliferation arena, disarmament arena. And on top of that, we have the war in Ukraine, where a nuclear weapon state, one of the responsible nuclear weapon states, Russia, who is behind the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, attacked a non-nuclear weapon state behind a wall of 6,000 nuclear weapons. Very cowardly. And explicitly threatened to use these nuclear weapons on different occasions during the war. So if you ask me which nuclear weapon state may use nuclear weapons first in the short and medium term, it's Russia. Luckily, Russia is holding on the terrain. It's not losing, because the threat of nuclear weapons used by Russia will increase if Russia is pushed out of Ukraine. That's not happening for the moment, and I think the world should be thankful for that. And I'm not defending Putin, by the way. I'm not a Putin lover, but I'm looking to this war from the eyes of the world and global order and stability. And in that respect, there is a real risk that Russia may use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, which may then escalate to a global nuclear war in the worst case. And we should, of course, prevent that.
Now, we've had other moments when nuclear weapon states attack non-nuclear weapon states, right? I mean, most blatantly, certainly the United States invasion of Iraq back in 2003, and basically all of the interventions of nuclear weapon states, including basically what happened when NATO was fighting against Serbia in 1999. But you're absolutely right that this situation could have been very different because neither the US nor NATO were ever in danger of losing this war, whereas here we didn't know. Heinz, I also recall that you were saying that this is a real danger. Do you agree with Tom that the threat level from Russia using nuclear weapons because the war would turn against it has now decreased compared to, like, let's say, a year ago?
I think Tom is correct. There is possibility that one of the nuclear weapon states and, of course, also Russia might use nuclear weapons. But I would rather talk a little bit about the structural reasons and causes for the increasing danger of using nuclear weapons. We have this tendency that nuclear weapons are more usable. Since the beginning of the first use of nuclear weapons have two dimensions. One is deterrence, but it's not only deterrence, but it's also the possibility of warfighting, to make them warfighting weapons. And we had this already in Hiroshima. In Hiroshima, the atomic bombs had two functions. One is to deter Russia from occupying Japan, and the second, of course, was a military dimension. And then we had the same debate in the 50s, 60s with the mutual assured destruction, when both sides tried to make them usable. Even so, this always led to this suicide development. So if you use nuclear weapons first, the second strike would destroy you yourself. But they've already built in levels, escalation levels in all the triads, the naval and the air and the land-based missiles. And everybody tried to find a level where they have the escalation dominance and where they could stop and win the war. That was not really credible. And then NATO came up with a flexible response theory. So if Russia and the Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union at that time, would start a conventional war, we start with smaller nuclear weapons, and then go up the escalation ladder, which, by the way, was invented by Hermann Kahn. He had several escalation steps where nuclear war can be fought about. And now we have a development really where nuclear weapons are pretty small. Pretty small means half of the Hiroshima yield. And we don't have this INF treaty anymore. The INF treaty was concluded because there was a possibility in Europe, there was a strong peace movement about this as well, that a nuclear war could be limited to the European battleground, because these tactical and smaller nuclear weapons, the Soviet SS-20, the Pershing II, and cruise missiles, could be used only on the European territory, because they were small enough, what they perceived, not to escalate to the highest level, the mutual assured destruction. Now we have smaller nuclear weapons on the one hand, and we don't have a treaty anymore. the INF Treaty, which has been abandoned in 2019. So the danger to use nuclear weapons and to think there can be a limited nuclear war is here. But Tom is, of course, right, because you never know whether it doesn't escalate to a global level, to the strategic level, the big missiles which can destroy the US and or Washington and Moscow at the same time. But there is the attempt by the nuclear weapon states to limit them. And of course, if Russia thinks I can use smaller tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the idea is, okay, let's limit it to Ukraine and not escalate it. And maybe the other side would blink and give up. But you never can be sure. But you had the same idea already with other nuclear weapon states. And so in every conflict we have since the Korean War, the US was involved in, there was a debate whether the US should use nuclear weapons, whether it's also Vietnam. And so we don't have treaties anymore. Arms control is in shambles, and we have modernized nuclear weapons. And there's deterrence, and the argument is deterrence works better if you have nuclear weapons which are small enough to use them. So nuclear weapons which are usable, but deterrence is the pretense also to create warfighting nuclear weapons.
But we have very different strategies about this by the nuclear weapon states, right? I mean, we have North Korea, which constantly is very proud of its weapons and also threatens to use them. We have the United States, which doesn't rule out first use. We have Russia that simultaneously kind of threatens it, but then also simultaneously says a nuclear war can't be won and must never be fought. And then we have the silent one. How worried, Tom, are you about Israel, especially after that comment of this one cabinet minister who said we might use a nuclear weapon to flatten Gaza? Israel has no doctrine, right? I mean, not to the external side, not to us analysts. Internally, they must have something. But how worried are you about Israel using it, maybe not on Gaza, but on Iran?
Yeah, it was surprising to hear, indeed, not only a member of parliament in Israel, but then a week later also a minister talking about the possible use of nuclear weapons, Israeli nuclear weapons, on Gaza, on top of the destruction that we see already now, with 80% of the buildings destroyed. Of course, this was not mainstream, and this minister has been sacked by Netanyahu. Or at least suspended, but it says something about the feelings in the Israeli society about this war that is going on. But personally, I do not believe that Israel will do this. By the way, this war is ending. Israel has already attacked the north, the middle is now in the south of Gaza. So if you ask my prediction, they will withdraw in a couple of weeks or months at the latest. But you're right. The big threat in the Middle East is the tension between Israel on the one hand and Iran. And if you say Israel, more and more there are peace agreements with Israel, and there is this possibility of a new peace agreement with Saudi Arabia and Israel. So that would make the tensions bigger, and Israel and Iran is very close at the moment getting a bomb. They have the ingredients. It's just a political decision that needs to be made by Ayatollah Khamenei. We can discuss this because I'm sure Heinz has some opinion on this as well. But if Iran goes nuclear, it can go both ways. Those who are in favor of nuclear deterrence will say, this will stabilize the region. Both states will have nuclear weapons. Now, others who are more worried, like I think myself and maybe also Heinz, will say, then there's the possibility that nuclear weapons will be used in the Middle East at a certain moment in time.
I mean, Israel has repeatedly killed Iranian nuclear scientists in Iran, and the United States has blown up Mr. Soleimani, a top-ranking general in Baghdad 2 years ago. So the threat of something happening in Iran is huge. Heinz, what are your greatest worries when it comes to this nuclear program of Iran, that it might be torpedoed first, or that when it's actually launched, that then this might be a casus belli?
Let me first talk a little bit about Israel's nuclear program, the first question you asked, Tom. I think Israelis nuclear weapons have another dimension, and we scholars call it nuclear coercion. So we saw it in the Yom Kippur War when Moshe Dayan, the defense minister then, blackmailed more or less the US and was saying there's an existential threat, and if you don't provide us with more weapons, we might threaten to use our nuclear weapons. So to scare the US, if they don't send more weapons and help Israel, Israel might play the card of nuclear weapons. So it's a little bit what also Putin did. So the sort of nuclear coercion has more dimensions. Not only that one nuclear weapon state might use nuclear weapons, but also blackmail big powers to help them out not to use, that they're not forced to use them. And we can come into a similar situation right now. If Israel makes the case that there is an existential threat, maybe not in Gaza, but if there is the tit for tat with Hezbollah in Lebanon is escalating and Iran might get involved, Israel might well say, all right, we have to threaten to use our nuclear weapons because now our existence is in danger. And I think what the cultural minister was threatening with the use of nuclear weapons in Gaza actually was deliberate. It was deliberate to show we have something what we could use in a broader Middle Eastern war. He was, of course, as Tom said, sacked, but he was sacrificed because somebody had to say this. And of course, it was an admission at the same time that Israel has nuclear weapons, but so far they didn't really clearly admit. Pascal, you wanted to ask something.
Do we have estimates of how many nuclear weapons and what type they have? Also, are they mounted on rockets, or would they have to be delivered by airplane?
Maybe, Tom, you know more. So it's about estimates up between 80 and 200 nuclear warheads Israel has in the facilities of Diamond. We don't know where else they're deployed. But basically, what I know, there should be deployed on middle-range missiles. But Tom, maybe you have better information about this.
Secret.
Yeah, because it's more or less a secret, you know. Because the Israelis don't really talk about it. So, and this is also the problem why the idea of the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East doesn't go off the ground, because Israel has nuclear weapons, doesn't admit it, so they cannot really abandon if they don't have them, but they have them. So that's and of course the US in the United Nations and in the Non-Proliferation Review Conference is always blocks the idea of nuclear weapon-free so on in the Middle East. I do see, also, at the moment, I don't think that Iran is going to go nuclear, as you ask. They want to achieve the status of Japan, more or less. So to be a threshold state, because the Iranians know they can't really use them without being destroyed. But they want to show we can do it if we want it, and also they use it as an instrument for the West, for a political tool as well. So the bigger danger right now is that Iran gets involved in the Middle Eastern war. If, as I said, Israel is also provoking, even so the Houthis, of course. Hezbollah. Hezbollah Houthis are sending also weapons to the Red Sea, but the Hezbollah is sending weapons to the north of Israel, but at the same time, Israel is assassinating Hezbollah leaders and not only Hamas leaders in Lebanon. And of course, Iran is always saying we are behind Hezbollah, but we don't want to get involved in a bigger war. And it's Hezbollah's own decision to get in, to make their plans. But at some point, maybe Iran might get involved. Is there more assassinations also on Iranian militias, which are Iranian supported in Iraq and in Syria? And if Iran is involved, Israel makes the case that the US should be involved as well. And of course, Netanyahu, the big enemy for Netanyahu is not so much Hamas in the Middle East. So they might somehow eliminate the military structure of Hamas. The big enemy, the remaining enemy for Netanyahu is Iran. And because Iran is geopolitical and natural hegemon in the region. And that's what Israel thinks is a danger for Israel. Hamas does not put in question Israel's existence, but Hezbollah plus Iran could do it.
Let's stick with the nuclear issue for just a moment, and then we go further into this. Tom, is there anything you would want to add to this one?
But on Iran and nuclear weapons, we should mention that the JCPOA negotiations are basically dead. This is the nuclear deal that has been signed in 2015, then thrown in the dustbin by Trump in 2018. Biden came to power with the idea to bring more new life into the agreement, but it failed. First with the Rouhani administration, a couple first 6 months, and then later on with the more conservative Raisi government. And it's difficult to find out who has to be blamed most. I think Obama, both governments were under pressure from the opposition. Obama by the Republicans not to give in and put the bar very high, but also probably on the Iranian side, you have the guards who are, and some of them may be interested in finally getting a bomb. So in addition, Iran is sanctioned, but they don't feel it anymore because now they trade with the East, with China, with Russia, with Turkey. So for them, the sanctions are less painful than before. They're still painful, but they can live under it. That's at least the impression that I have looking to the regime in Tehran. And some of these groups in Iran also gain by the sanctions, the black market. And here again, I refer to the guards. So that explains why there's no progress in reviving the JCPOA talks. In my view, they are basically dead. And yeah, that opens in that brings us to the Japanese option, where both Japan and in Iran basically have the possibility to produce nuclear weapons in a couple of weeks or months. But in my view, there's still a bigger risk in Iran that the Ayatollah, Supreme Ayatollah, Khamenei decides to go nuclear formally, in the sense testing a nuclear weapon and publicly declaring that it has nuclear weapons
as a policy, yeah, and challenge to Israel and the US. But let me ask you a last question, or a last round of questions on the state of this emergency. Tom, you said we are like, it's pretty bad at the moment, the international legal framework and the political framework for nuclear weapons control. We've seen much better times actually in the 1980s during the latter part of the Cold War, when we had agreements that were struck, and now they all collapsed, almost everything. The one we still have is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and we have the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was rammed through the United Nations against the will of the 5 permanent nuclear weapon states by by developing nations, and a couple of others like Austria was part of it. And this has now 50 ratifications, which means it now has the force of international law behind it. And you 2 years ago wrote an article saying that the Western allies should not discount this effort. Where are we today, Tom? Do you still think that the TPNW has force, and what is it doing to the dynamic at the moment for the legal framework?
You're right. The legal framework is in a bad shape. Just mention very shortly the treaties, CTBT on testing has not been entered into force. It's not entered into force. The ABM treaty does not exist anymore on missile defense. INF has been mentioned, it's not anymore by Trump. Open Skies Treaty has been suspended by and put thrown in the dustbin by Trump. New START, the latest one, bilaterally on strategic nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, has been extended by Biden and Trump, but it ends in 2026. And nobody expects that there will be a successor. And that will be the first time since the beginning of the 70s that there will be no bilateral strategic arms control treaty anymore. And so these two superpowers, nuclear superpowers, then have the freedom to build up without any bilateral control and verification. And the NPT is also in crisis, in my view. The last 2 review conferences of the NPT failed to come up with a consensus document. So you're right. The only bright spot is the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, signed in 2017 by 122 states in the world. I mean, not signed, but concluded in the framework of the United Nations. That means 2/3 of all states in the world, non-nuclear weapon states, basically from the South, Global South, Africa, Latin America, Asia, but also a couple of European states like Austria, Switzerland were involved. Switzerland finally did not sign. And it's still a revolutionary thing, you know. This is the first treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons. Just like chemical and biological weapons have been prohibited, and landmines and cluster munitions. So it closed the legal gap in the nuclear arena, and it should be interpreted as a signal to the nuclear weapon states: take nuclear disarmament serious. The promise of Article 6 in the NPT. Now, as you said or indicated, the nuclear weapon states, or the nuclear armed states in general, didn't like the treaty. It came too soon, and they were very defensive, dismissive about this treaty right from the start, and it has not been changed in the meantime. So there's this polarization going on, and it started already before the TPNW, between the non-nuclear weapon states that are not allied to the nuclear weapon states, the biggest group in the world, and on the other side, the nuclear weapon states and their allies, basically 40 states in the world, a minority. So, and this polarization is going up within the framework of the NPT. So it doesn't look good for the future of the NPT either. Now, the goal behind the TPNW is still there. So to enhance the norm against nuclear weapons, to stigmatize nuclear weapons and those who possess nuclear weapons, and by that creating a new societal and political debate inside the nuclear weapon states and their allies, because we cannot change their policy from the outside. It should come from within. Yeah, that's the whole idea behind the TPNW, and we see small elements of impact at the local level. That means cities, communities speaking out, also in nuclear weapon states against nuclear weapons. In the private sector, banks, pension funds speaking out against nuclear weapons, also in the nuclear weapon states and the allies, including in my own country. And it's of course, it's very difficult to make a relation or a causal relation, but in some international organizations like the G20, there was an interesting statement recently about the fact that nuclear weapons use is inadmissible as a reaction to what's happening or is happening in Ukraine. Now, one could argue that without the TPNW, maybe this statement would not have been there. Yeah? Mm-hmm. But of course, this is an interpretation. But to have real impact, and I close with that, I think even more non-nuclear weapon states should sign up, because for the moment only 96, I believe, have signed up out of these 122. And once these 100, 110, 120 have signed up, then it's up to the allied non-nuclear weapon states, countries like Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, to change their mind, because if they don't change their mind, there will be no pressure on the nuclear weapon states.
Yeah,
so there's a crucial role for these states in the future.
And it is a strategy. And Heinz, just very, very briefly, can you maybe expand a little bit on this strategy behind the TPNW, and if you think it can work in the long run to actually put pressure, internal pressure?
No, of course, the so-called PEN Treaty, it created a new norm. So far, as I said before, deterrence was a dominant norm, and now disarmament is another norm, which has a legal basis, because the nuclear weapon states did not really observe their obligations under the NPT Treaty Article 6 to negotiate in good faith for nuclear disarmament. So they closed the treaty closed the legal gap. Having said this, the security establishment of the nuclear weapon states and Europe as well, they're going in the different directions. So Tom and we attended a conference in Brussels, which is a conference on an EU conference on non-proliferation and disarmament, as it is called. But dominating was the norm deterrence and defense, and not disarmament. So the PEN Treaty hardly was mentioned. So it's not accidental that most of the signatories and ratifications of the PEN Treaty come from the Global South. So if you look at the continent, Europe is the continent where the least members of the treaty come from, of course, because we have the NATO states. And the NATO states, of course, rely also on the nuclear umbrella of the US, and we have also this nuclear sharing, and the nuclear umbrella concept is saying basically the opposite what the PEN Treaty is saying. There's the nuclear umbrella concept says we are using nuclear weapons if you are attacked. The PAN Treaty is saying we promise not to use nuclear weapons. So there are very different concepts for the nuclear weapon states and the allies. The more nuclear weapons give us more security, and the supporters and the non-nuclear weapon states would say less nuclear weapons would increase our security, because we don't want to become a target of a nuclear exchange. So, and the supporters of the PAN Treaty are saying we are also the nuclear weapon states would be more secure without nuclear weapons, because they would not be a target of a nuclear weapons exchange. So very different concepts, and unfortunately, I do see that deterrence and defense is the dominant norm now, even so we still have, of course, the PAN Treaty as an alternative norm.